Okay, today, we're gonna try something different. I'm gonna read from this book that is a harmony of all of the Gospels. And I'm gonna try to have you follow, some in Mark, some in Matthew, some in Luke. And what it will do is just to help us see what a harmony of the Gospel does, how different each account can be with details. Ellen was just telling me that after last week's class, they were talking about it in the house, and they were looking out into the field for their living room. And they described what they saw, and it was so different.
Right.
You know, and so that's a good example of what we sort of looked at last week. Who thought much about that afterwards? I mean, is that something you ever heard before?
What do you mean?
About the denials of Peter? When we listened to the video.
No, you didn't really think
you
about
weren't
it.
here.
I didn't.
He describes how he denied him 6 different times. And it's all written in here. He used this book. He said he really depended on this book, and I just came across it by accident. And so it was like, well, that's really, interesting. But you have to do something with what is written in Mark. Mark says after the first denial, a cock crowed. Well, if that really happened, then Jesus was wrong. Because he said the cock will not crow before you deny me 3 times. So they're different denials. And go ahead.
And also pointing out that it was Mark that was giving Peter's account.
Peter did not write a gospel,
Peter.
you're right. Peter, Mark was a scribe for Peter. He worked with him, worked closely with him. In the epistles, he called him my son Peter, my son Mark. So he knew Peter's account. And he's the one that tells us all those details about Peter. The way the guy put that together in the podcast that we listened to, it was very entertaining for one thing, but it's sort of like the Chosen series, if you're watching that, how the story is filled in, so they're taking some liberty, with what probably happened, that something like this probably happened. But just an interesting thing, I think maybe next class, which I'm not going to teach next week, Alan's going to teach next week, because I'm going to be out of surgery and I don't know what I'm going to be doing, so. So I'm going to have him teach next week, but when we come back the following week, we'll probably play the rest of that video, because it goes through the Garden of Gethsemane, and it goes through the arrest of Jesus, and so what we're doing is we're still filling in that timeline. This is still the Passover day, where all of history was fulfilled in Christ on that day. That's why it's so important. So we're looking at a timeline. I skipped over Gethsemane last week because Jesus predicted Peter's denials. Gethsemane happened, and then the denials happened after that. So I went right to the denials. And what time frame did that get us to? The denials of Christ.
What time frame?
Yeah. The roosters were crowing.
Oh,
So-
so like 3
so-
a.m.,
So we're looking at like dawn,
3
probably.
to 6 a.m.
Probably 5 or 6. One thing about that time, you're remembering the cock crowing watch. It was midnight to 3.
Right.
In ancient Israel, it was midnight to 4. I didn't go into that because it's confusing enough,
Right.
but the Hebrews had 4 watches in the night. Yeah, well, they had the 4. But there was 3 in the Romans had 3. So I sort of followed that. So it changed over time a little bit. But when the roosters start crowing is when they start to sense and see some light. So we're looking toward morning. So if they got to the garden about 10:30, 11, then what were all those hours in between? Well, a big part of it was in the garden. And we think that they went in, they prayed, they prayed 3 times. Well, there's some clues in there, and we're gonna look at that today. I wanna read it from this book, and then I'm gonna have you follow along, and a lot of it you'll say, it's not what I'm looking at, but it's in the other Gospels. If you're seeing that, it's in the other Gospels. Now, I'm not gonna have anybody go to John, because John doesn't say very much about the Garden of Gethsemane. So we know that story, but here's what, I wanna just say this. It's in John 18:1 if you wanted to turn there right now. But what does John say about the Garden of Gethsemane? Almost nothing. In the NIV, it is nothing. Because they say, in the NIV it says, they went across the Kidron Valley and into an olive grove. And that's all the NIV says.
This one says, after saying these things, Jesus crossed the Kidron Valley with his disciples and entered into a grove of olive trees.
Okay. Now, actually, it is an important detail that he gives us, but that's all they give it. That's all he says about the garden there.
Mm-hmm.
But there actually is the word garden in there.
Oh.
It's they went across the Kidron Valley where there was a garden and they entered into it. That's the only place we see garden.
Mm-hmm.
There was a place across the Kidron Valley called Gethsemane. It wasn't the Garden of Gethsemane. It was believed to be the olive press, a cave. The garden was up the mountain a little bit. It wasn't to the top, but it was up the mountain, believed to be, where the olive grove was. So they weren't in this cave. Some people do teach that they went into this, where the olive press was. But John is the only one that does give us that detail. And it's really about all he gives us. So, I'm gonna go ahead and read this.
When you read it, does it tell what gospel you're reading?
It tells me, but I can't read that.
Okay.
Because I'll read 3 words and say 1.
Oh.
3 words and say 4.
Okay.
So I can't really do that, but you will see it.
All right.
Just keep talking a bit. Okay, so let me find where I am. I should have put a book in there.
Did a good job walking and chewing at the same time.
Yeah, that's one thing I can do. Okay, on the way to Gethsemane, there was a whole bunch of teaching. Okay, I want some of you, let's say this side, go to Matthew 26, 36. Mark, down there, Mark 14, 32. And over here, Luke 22, 40. One thing I told you to watch for last week when we listened to that podcast was the 3s. 3 denials, and he predicted 3 times that he would deny him, or that he would make 3 denials, and then he told him twice. But we see the same thing in here. Through this whole story, we see a lot of this, so just notice that if you can catch it. And notice anything you can see about time. Okay. Then came Jesus with them across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, a place called Gethsemane, into which he and his disciples entered. And when he had arrived at the place, he said to them, "Sit here while I go yonder and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, he began to be sorrowful and amazed and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. Remain here and watch with me. Pray that you enter not into temptation." And going forward from them a little farther, about a stone's throw, he knelt down on the ground and fell on his face and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee, my Father. If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt." So in the way we read that now, he's using more King James English. But he says, not my will, but your will be done, is what he's saying. Okay, and so it continues, and he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep?" He found them sleeping. And he said to Simon, "Simon, are you asleep?" And why would he single Simon out there? Why would he single out Peter? Peter's the one that told him, "I'm gonna go where you're," yeah. So he finds them all sleeping, but he's, I guess you could say he's picking on them a little bit, but he's sort of gracious to him too. We'll see that in the end, but he said, "Simon, are you asleep? So you could not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, that you enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Now, you're seeing a lot of words in your version that I'm reading that aren't there, right?
Right.
Well, that's because it's in another version, or it's in the other Gospels.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of detail, and that is a good example of how important it is to see the whole picture. There's 4 accounts,
Right.
and when you take them all together, there's so much more detail. Again and again, a second time, he went off and prayed, saying, "My Father, if thou art willing, take away this cup from me. Nevertheless, if this cannot pass from me, unless I drink it, not my will, but thy will be done." And there appeared unto him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in an agony, he prayed the more earnestly. And his sweat became, as it were, like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. And when he rose up from the prayer, this is the second time, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping again, for sorrow, for their eyes were heavy. And he said to them, "Why do you sleep? Rise up and pray, so that you may not enter into temptation." Just while we're right there, just notice Jesus, he came to the disciples, he found them sleeping again the second time. And all 3 accounts give reasons for that. He said they found him sleeping again for sorrow. They were very sorrowful. Jesus recognized that. For their eyes were heavy. He realized they were mortal men, and as he was too. He faced the cross as a man, but they weren't prepared in the spirit. And their tiredness just took over.
And I don't think they fully understood what was happening either.
Not exactly. Not exactly. But if they were sorrowful, they understood something. I mean, he'd just been talking to them for 3 hours.
Right, and they could see Jesus agonizing in prayer. What he was
Yes.
doing, they could see that, but I don't think they fully understood why or what was
Yeah.
happening.
And he told them
Mm-hmm.
how he felt
Right.
and why he was there to pray. And he took, we'll get into that later. Rise up and pray so that you may not enter into temptation. And they knew not what to answer him. They didn't even know what to say. Probably feeling the disappointment of, he just told us he needs somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And we weren't there. So he left them and he went off again and he prayed a third time, saying the same thing as before. Then came he to the disciples the third time and said to them, "Are you sleeping even now and taking your rest? It is enough. Behold, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Let us be going. Lo, my betrayer is at hand." And we'll look at the betrayal in the next class probably. But what we see here in that story is, I mean, did anybody learn anything new? Just putting it all together?
Well, I think just focusing more, I mean, when we read that account, we're always thinking about what Jesus agonized and went through and how he suffered in the garden and sweat drops of blood. We always hear that, and we don't, and we kind of skim over, like you said, what the disciples were going through. Why couldn't they stay awake? Why couldn't they, enter into that prayer with him? Why, just to see what the disciples were going through, when they were right there with him at the same time, the difference of what Jesus was going through and what the disciples were going through is what sticks out to me.
How about the threes?
And that he prayed 3 different times.
Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of slide over that too.
And he found him sleeping
Right, and confronted them 3 times.
3 times.
Yes.
And there were 3 of them.
And there were the three were with him. He took-
They had a long day,
Very
and
Yes.
it wasn't, when they're traveling back and forth, like they're walking
Yes.
distances, they weren't fatigued, they were,
And here,
and sometimes when you mean the best, you can't stay awake, but he's trying to encourage them to wait and watch.
and
We do.
I would say, I fall asleep praying all the time.
yeah, and when you're under
Stress.
an attack of the enemy,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's, he does with prayer. I mean, it's a spiritual battle, is what it is. These men, I mean, it was about midnight. Did anybody notice the time in there? If they got there about 10:30, 11 o'clock, probably is what what we're estimating. It gives us an idea of time. This was not like he didn't pray for 10 minutes.
Yep.
He came back to him and what was the question he asked him?
1 hour.
Couldn't you even pray with me for an hour? And then he did it 2 more times. There was another 3 in there. Did anybody catch the other 3? Well, a couple more really, but Look at Jesus' prayer. Tells us what he prayed. And he did it 3 times. He prayed, Father, if there's any way this can be done without me drinking this cup, can we take it away? And then the second time he went out, he prayed the same thing. And the third time he went out, what did it say there?
Nevertheless, your will, not mine.
Well, he said that every time. Another 3.
Okay.
3 times he said that.
Your will.
Submitted himself
your
to the
be
Father's
done, not
will.
mine.
But the third time, it doesn't spell it out for us. It says, this is in Matthew. So he left them and went off again and prayed a third time. Saying what, Matthew? He went away the third time to pray, saying the same thing. 3 times he prayed, can we take this cup away? But Jesus submitted himself to the will of the Father. And some will teach that he sweat great drops of blood.
Right.
Jesus did not sweat great drops of, he was a man, and if he did that,
You did it.
There
his
is a
blood would be
disease
gone.
that you do that.
Right.
Pardon?
There is a disease that you sweat
Yes,
blood.
but Jesus didn't have that.
Yeah, he didn't die of that.
But I'm saying there is.
Yeah.
Yes,
I've
there
never
is.
said that before.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Mhm.
Or is it?
But in there it says like,
Like.
yeah, or as it were great drops of blood.
He
It's just
agonized.
that,
You could tell he was agonizing.
right, the emotion. What are the lessons of Gethsemane? That's what I want to talk about for the rest of the class. I just went through some of that, but let me go through my notes. We see the humanity of Jesus through his emotion, the emotion that he faced. And it tells us what he says. He began to be sorrowful and amazed is one of the, sore amazed, I think is what the King James says. And deeply distressed. And in a couple of versions it says sorrowful twice. Sorrowful and then more sorrowful to the point of death. Jesus is feeling it. Jesus is facing it as a man. He knows that the nails are going to go in to his hands and his feet. Jesus knew how he was going to die.
Well, I often, when I think of that, Jesus definitely won the victory on the cross, but I believe that victory was won in Gethsemane before he even went onto the cross. It was in those 2 prayers, it was in that time agonizing before God and interceding and praying and laying down his own will, that the victory of the cross was won, is what I believe.
Yeah.
And he faced the cross like, this is it, I've already won.
And if that's, what does that tell us about prayer?
How
What does that teach
powerful-
us about prayer?
How powerful and important prayer is in our own lives.
Yeah. That we, to overcome, we have to be connected to Christ and in his, or to God, through Christ, and in his will,
Right,
in submitting to his will, not following our own way.
right.
One of the things I said last week was when Peter said to the Lord, I'm going where you're gonna go. And he says, you can't go there now, but you'll go later. Where Jesus was going was right here. He was going to the cross. And Peter did go later. He went to a cross and was crucified upside down. And that was the humility that he took. Because the tradition is that he asked to be crucified that way. He didn't deserve to die like his Lord. As a tradition. But one of the things I said last week was, when Jesus said that to him, that you can't come with me now, it wasn't that he didn't have permission to. He couldn't.
It wasn't his time.
He couldn't. He wasn't prepared.
Right.
He could never make it through.
He couldn't even make it through through the night.
Right. And I think that's part of the expression Jesus had, Peter, not even 1 hour? You're gonna go with me, but you couldn't even make it an hour? It's sort of, Peter's intention was good. You know, he said he was gonna fight for the Lord, and he pulled out a sword, and he took a swing before Jesus put an end to that. But he intended to do that. And as we listened to that podcast last week, I think Ellen posted it online. If you want to listen to that, we only listened to the first 22 minutes, and then I was going to go back probably the next class and listen to this part of it. But very, very interesting, and that guy expresses in his thoughts how Peter, he denied him because he had to stay close to him. You know, he was going to fight. And he just totally didn't understand that the battle was spiritual and what Jesus was going to do. But it wasn't that he didn't have permission, like, you know, the permission slip you get for your teacher to go. It wasn't that he didn't have that. He just was not capable of doing it. And he's seeing that in all of this when he went out and wept bitterly after after the denials that we saw last week. But Jesus knew what kind of death he was going to face. Everybody knows John 3:16. Does anybody know John 14 and 15? This is the beginning of his ministry, when that is said. John 3. This is what it says. I think, before you look at it, I can just tell you this. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. It goes clear back to Exodus. When the children of Israel, the Passover lamb was sacrificed, the journey started. First day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. A Christian walk starts after we receive the salvation, the blood of Christ as our Passover lamb, and we begin our walk. Well, during that time, what happened in the wilderness when they were bitten by snakes?
Moses rose the pole with a snake on it.
Yes. That is John 3:14 and 15. Points clear back to Exodus. Jesus knew when he said that, he knew how he was going to die. He probably knew it much earlier. John 3:14 and 15. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him. That was where life would come from. It was through the fulfillment of that thing that they saw in Exodus, the walk out of Egypt and into the promised land.
The beginning of my next verse says, "For this is how God so loved the world."
Yeah, that's I like that. I like that.
For this is how
That
God
he was
so
lifted
loved
up and
the world.
fulfilled that. Another place that we see in the Exodus account, the picture of Christ and what he would do. But Jesus knew, and he, in this garden, why was he so perplexed, distressed, troubled? One of the versions says troubled, sorrowful, because he was walking to that place. The physical walk, this is from where they were coming into the city to the to the upper room. Then they went back out to the Kidron Valley and part way up to the garden. And then from there, he was arrested. They brought him back in, not too far from the upper room, to the high priest's house. Then they took him from there to Pilate. Pilate sent him to Annas,
I thought it come to here.
not to Annas.
Herod.
No,
Herod.
Annas was over at the high priest's house.
Herod.
He sent him to Herod.
Yeah.
And then he sent him back. And then they sent him out to Golgotha.
Mhm.
About 2.5 miles. That walk, all of that. It's like, how could they go to all those places in such a short time? Because the denials, right about daybreak. When was Jesus on the cross?
3,
Well, before that.
9.
9 a.m. He was on the cross, they put him on the cross. It tells us
He was on there until 3.
at the 9th hour.
9.
And so,
So for 3 hours, they shuffled them around between those places.
right. Right.
From like 6 a.m. to
Before
like-
that,
Yeah,
from whenever they came out of the garden, from whenever they brought him out.
yeah.
So they were walking around, but just to give you an idea, it's, they say 4 kilometers, which is about 2.5 miles.
It just made me think of, when our friends went to Israel, Debbie Harwell, she told me, they went and she was showing us her pictures and stuff, and we saw this room where they took Jesus. It's said to have, they've taken Jesus before the high priest, they kept him in this room. And she said that was one of the most powerful places being in that room,
Was it like a dungeon?
like a dungeon.
It was like a jail, a
Yeah,
dungeon.
that
It
they
was
kept him in. And
under
she-
the,
It was under
high
the
priest's
priest's
house.
Yep,
and it's where they flogged him.
yep,
Has the rings where they tie his hands.
she
There
said
was
it
a
was one of the
trough
most
to
powerful
catch
places
blood.
and she just felt the weight of it, being there, and she just cried and just felt the weight of it.
Yeah, when I read about that, I thought about the place in Cartagena, where we went into that jail where they tortured people.
Oh, yeah,
I thought about that, but yeah, it'd be powerful to see it.
just man's inhumanity
And-
to man is astounding.
And a lot of the things you see in Israel, it's like,
Right, it's a touristy place.
yeah, and they don't, like the upper room, they'll show it to you, but they're not exactly sure. I mean, who knows? But
But at least you walk the same ground.
it could be, it
Yeah.
could be, yeah, it could be what they show you. You just never know. But it would be powerful to see it.
And when we read through these scriptures, we just don't get the sense of what Jesus really went through.
Not until you look at it
To
deeply,
really, yeah.
like this.
Mhm.
When you look at it, realize how far it was. A lot of people say they couldn't have possibly done all that walking. Well, how long does it take to walk 2.5 miles?
Right, not 3 hours.
Yeah, I mean, there was time for the trial and stuff too, but.
All I did back then was walk.
That's
Yeah.
right. Pretty much, they were good at it, yeah.
Well,
You can walk a mile in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not,
Yeah.
not running.
Right.
So, yeah, it's interesting, but Jesus knew, from early on, what he was gonna face. And this, he says, the hour has come. He knew that it was now, that he was dealing with it. His emotions, we talked about him, sore amazed, and he began to be very heavy, the King James says, or sorrowful, deeply distressed. His soul was exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. In agony, his prayer became even more earnest, is what one of the versions it says. So it really expresses his humanity. You know, we think, well, he was God too. Well, he took on the sin of man, and God doesn't do that. He faced the cross as a man. When I've talked about it before, going back to the picture in Moses, or that Moses put up, the snake on a pole. How could that represent Jesus? The snake represents the devil to me. I've never seen a snake I didn't try to kill. I hate snakes.
The
And-
after one now.
snake represented the sin of the world that was
Absolutely.
placed on the cross.
When God saw Jesus on the cross, he saw the sin of the world on him.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, why did he forsake me?
Mhm.
Because of the sin.
God cannot look at the sin of people.
Yeah.
He had to turn his back.
I like the point that when they were talking about how he went to the pit of hell and then came out victorious. God said, well, that wasn't his sin, that was the world's sin, and therefore you can't hold them.
You know, well, he took the sin of the world and overcame it in the grave, overcame. That picture of resurrection, Feast of First Fruits.
Right.
And Jesus was resurrected. A lot of other people were too.
Yes.
I mean, you
Hundreds.
might not
Hundreds.
remember
of
that.
Yeah,
Said hundreds
People
of people were
walk-
walking around.
I
Whoa!
I wish we knew more about that.
I know. They just kind of get past
That
and say,
doesn't
yeah, there's
save us,
500
so it's
people
not important.
came out of the
Yeah.
grave.
Yeah.
Wow!
But that was,
Yeah.
it's something that, you know, probably a lot of people don't know.
the amazing thing is they've seen all these people and yet
And
they
still
deny
Yep,
he was God.
Yeah.
It's like,
yep. They still tried to pretend that somebody took his body out of the
oh
Right.
my God.
That's more of the Romans.
The Romans were,
And,
but the
and
secular world. Yeah.
and
And the Jews.
religious
And
leaders,
the religious leaders,
Religious,
you know,
yeah.
yeah, they were still denying it, yeah.
Right,
I'll bet a lot of people weren't.
right.
I'll bet a lot of people weren't.
Especially the relatives who saw their relatives. Oh,
She made
That's a good point.
a good point, and I wanna just ask a couple questions about it. She said that, like, when Jesus died on the cross and then he went into hell, but because he was sinless, the grave couldn't hold him. So when he died on the cross, I guess I had in my mind that he went into hell to overcome, but did he go to hell because of the sins of the people? Like we would go to hell because of our sins if it weren't for Jesus? Like is that why,
He took our
because he was a sinner and sin goes to hell? Is that why he
Didn't-
went to hell?
Doesn't the scripture say that he went to release people that
Right.
had been
But
in,
the way she said
what's
it, it
called?
made us,
Sheol?
made me think of
Hades.
it a little
Hades
different.
or
Hades, Sheol, yeah.
Sheol,
Right.
yeah. He had gone down to release those. He was on a mission.
I think it actually says he
And
went to
take
preach
the-
to them.
To,
Yeah,
right,
to preach to them.
right. But I mean, it does make sense too, that I mean, if you're taking everybody's sin,
Right.
sin deserves death and all that.
Well, he
Yeah,
probably
he would-
dumped it on the way.
But the,
Yeah, but interesting
I
to think
know,
a little
yeah.
about that.
but then the scriptures were fulfilled
Right,
Yeah,
with,
right,
you know, because he was God,
right.
and he did the man part, and then he did the God part.
that's right. Yeah.
So the man part may have had to go to hell, and then he did the God
Yeah,
part.
because we don't have to go
Because
to
he was
hell.
perfect.
He went there for us.
Okay, so then, facing the cross as a man, how did Jesus learn obedience?
by the things that he suffered.
By the things that he suffered. Do you know the rest of that passage? We all know that part. Do we know the rest of the passage? It's in Hebrews 5, 7 to 10. I want to read it to you. During his earthly life, he offered prayers and appeals. We saw him doing that in the Garden of Gethsemane. He offered prayers and appeals with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. Jesus arose because God raised him. The one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Though he was God's son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. After he was perfected, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. And he was declared by God to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek, pointing back to Genesis. So it just showed, I thought of that verse just because it shows his humanity. He was God's son, but he was human too. During his earthly life, he offered prayers and appeals with loud cries and tears. That's where we're living. We have the example of Christ, where we have to spend the time seeking him and his help and asking. And the other part of that is we have to submit to his will, to God's will. We have to submit ourselves to that. That is the other thing that Jesus did 3 times. He asked as a man, is there any other way? Do I have to face this? If I do, I'll do it. Your will, not mine. He had to submit himself. Or he did that 3 times. And we have to do that to walk rightly with God.
Because sometimes God says no.
Well, I'm going to get to that right now.
Sorry.
That's all right. That's the way it should work.
Can I just share something? I think the garden is like before the thing you have to do too. Like for me, when I have to do something God wants me to do, the time before I'm getting really hammered, like, you don't want to do it, you don't want to do it, you know, like, that's a hard time to deal with. He knew what was going to happen and
Yeah.
pushed through by praying and obeying. But
That's the power of prayer. so
it's that time ahead
Yeah.
part though, like right before,
Yeah.
whatever.
The preparation.
Yeah.
And you have to be diligent. You have to be diligent. It's easy to go to sleep. It's easy. If I have trouble, what do, Karen?
Go to bed, shuts his eyes and goes to sleep immediately.
I'll pray about it and go to sleep.
I'm like, what? How can you do that?
So why worry about something that hasn't happened yet?
That's what he says.
Yeah. Good point.
Because that's what I do.
So, yeah, it's not because I'm good, it's because that's the way the Lord made me.
And I'm the opposite.
Okay.
That sounds like me and you.
He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John. And interesting that he took them that were so close to him. What else did they experience? He took them another time
Up to see the transfiguration.
to the transfiguration. And here he's expressing his sorrow. They saw his glory.
Yes.
And he's expressing his sorrow and his distress and saying, pray and watch with me. And they couldn't do it.
That's because he's,
What lesson does that have for us? I
that,
mean,
that's what he was teaching Peter, is he shouldn't do it in his own strength. He had
Yes.
to focus on God first and then do it in God's strength, not his own, because if we don't, we get ourselves into trouble.
and the merciful part of that is when Jesus saw him sleeping, it says, he says to them, the spirit is willing,
But the
but the flesh is weak. They were doing it all, Peter was doing it all in his flesh.
Yes, that's why he really could never do it.
Yeah, so it's like, I don't believe Jesus was criticizing
No.
them. He was teaching.
Yeah.
And the lesson that I think you take away from that is that our worst failures, I mean, because we've all been in that place where we went to sleep. We've all been in that place where we've, tried it in our own strength. It didn't work out too good. But I just think that was merciful of Christ. I don't think he was criticizing them at all. He was teaching them. Because in the upper room, he said, Peter, this is going to happen to you. But how did he say it? When you're recovered, when you're, I can't remember how he said it. When you're restored or whatever, because Jesus did restore him, right? 3 times.
Right.
He said, when you recover, take care of the brethren,
Yes.
Reach out
Yes,
and- yeah, take care. Well, that was at the end of John, though. He said, I don't have that in front of me, it just came to me right now, but he told Peter that Satan had desired to sift him as wheat in one of the Gospels. So another part of that story. He desired to sift him like wheat. But he said, when you recover, which means you're gonna recover.
You will, to get through it,
Yeah. And
you're gonna grow and learn.
so take that failure that Peter had, and it became, he says, he built the church.
Right.
He said, you're gonna be the rock upon which I build my church. These guys that failed became those that took the word,
To the world.
the message of Christ to the whole world. So your failure can be just like this. So we take heart in that. Jesus wasn't criticizing him. He said, your flesh is weak,
And ours-
even though the spirit is willing. To Karen's point, what was that you said? And I said, we're gonna deal with that right now.
Oh,
I got sidetracked.
um,
That you don't always get what you want.
Oh, Jesus, God says no.
Yeah, the God says no. Well, Jesus, we see that in the life of Christ right here. He said, if it's possible, take this cup from me. It wasn't possible.
It wasn't.
But God gave him the grace, and it's cool where it says the angels came and ministered. I think it's in Luke. Is the only one that tells us that angels came and ministered to him.
Because this was God's plan from the Garden of Eden. And right to the Garden of Gustin, it was always God's
Yeah.
plan that Jesus would come and lay down his life for
Yeah.
humanity.
Um,
It was always God's
so
plan.
the rest of my thought, let me see, where was I going with that?
But God says no.
But he says no, okay. You see it in the life of Christ right there. He submitted to the will of God. It wasn't possible what he wanted, that he had to go through that. The Lord gave him the grace to go through that and to do it. And sometimes he calms the storm. It's gone. The disciples experienced that. But sometimes he takes care of the storm in you, and then you go through.
Right.
That's how do we learn obedience?
The same.
By partaking in the sufferings of Christ. We talked about this on a Wednesday night, not this last time I did it, but 2 weeks, the second time ago. We gotta end it right there, although we're not quite done. I only did 4 pages today, I did about 2.5.